Good evening. I'm Jennifer McCrory. I'm the Director Curator of the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery, and I'm very pleased to have you all join us tonight for our In Conversation series for a discussion with Susan Shantz, Artist and Visual Arts Professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and Dr. Graham Strickert, a Research Associate for the Global Institute for Water Security, also with the University of Saskatchewan. Tonight, we're bringing together art and science for a discussion on Susan's exhibition Confluence, which is currently on display at the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery, and the research on prairie waterways that has not only informed her work, but stresses the importance of considering the sustainability and security of our water sources. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery is situated on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Nehewak, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. At the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery, we recognize that museums and art galleries are part of a colonial system, and we are committed to decolonizing our institution by inviting Indigenous voices to lead and inform our programming and presentations of Indigenous art, history, and narratives. I'm very pleased to introduce our presenters tonight. Susan Shantz is a Saskatoon artist and professor who teaches sculpture and mixed media in the Department of Art and Art History, the University of Saskatchewan, where she was awarded a Teaching Excellence Award in 2017. She's exhibited her work widely across Canada and internationally in solo and group exhibitions, and received grants from the Canada Council, Saskatchewan Arts Board, and British Columbia Arts Council. Her work is in numerous public and private art collections. Her recent mixed media installations include textiles, found objects, and video exploring our cultural connections to nature. In 2017, she and Dr. Graham Strickert co-taught an art and water studio course and co-produced the short film Becoming Water, connecting their teaching and research. Dr. Graham Strickert is a research associate for the Global Institute for Water Security at the U of S. He has worked in the private sector with Johnson & Johnson, the public sector with Land Care Research New Zealand, Environment Canada, and Agriculture Agri-Food Canada, as well as for universities that include Lakehead University, Lincoln University, the University of Canterbury, and the University of Saskatchewan. He holds a PhD in complex systems from Lincoln University. His research on water security in the Canadian prairies earned him the University of Saskatchewan Award for Distinction in Outreach and Public Service in 2014. His research is focused on the human dimensions of sustainability, answering the questions how we can harness divergent viewpoints to get more of what we want and less of what we don't want. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge our funders, which include Canada Council for the Arts, the Sask Arts, the City of Moose Jaw, Sask Culture, and Sask Lotteries. So I will let Susan take over. She's prepared a PowerPoint to talk about her work in the exhibition and in collaborations with Dr. Graham Strickert.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people joining the call tonight to hear about our work. And thank you very much, Jennifer, for that introduction and also for the opportunity to show at your gallery. It's just been a pleasure working with you and with Rob installing in January, and finally seeing the show for the first time last week when I came down in its complete installation. It's just thrilling to have so much space to show this work that I've been working away on for about 5 years, alongside some other projects that I'll talk about tonight. I do want to acknowledge that here in Saskatoon, where I'm on Treaty 6 territory. Jennifer acknowledged the land down in Moose Jaw where the gallery is. The first image on my slide actually shows the bridge, the CPR bridge built in 1907, I think, going over the South Saskatchewan River. And I wanted to start with this because it connects where I am on the river in Saskatoon. And this was an inspiration for my work, walking over this bridge daily before the pandemic to work at the university, which is on the other side of the river from where I live. So walking over this bridge, I was actually aware of the river below me and also thinking about where I am in Saskatoon in relation to where the river starts and where the river ends. So imaginatively, I would think of the Rocky Mountains where the water begins and where it flows into Hudson Bay into the ocean in Manitoba. But it also, so it connected me spatially to territory. It also made me think about time, you know, and how long people had been here before I was here, long before any settlers were on the prairie. So the land acknowledgement also points to this, that there were people living here for hundreds, 1,000 years before many of us came to the prairies. I also, besides walking over the river, I often walk beside the river, and especially since the pandemic, when I've not traveled as much out of the province or out of my city even, I take a lot of walks, as do many people in Saskatoon, along the river. The river is actually publicly accessible almost in its entirety in the city. There's paved paths that are accessible, and there's human-made paths walking down closer to the river. This is an area quite close to where I live, where I frequently walk. And just when I was preparing this talk on Monday, I got an email with a link to this wonderful podcast. Tasha Beed's in conversation with Jay Famglietti, who's the director of the Global Institute for Water Security, someone Graham knows. I was really moved to hear Tasha talk about her role as a water walker, so an Indigenous ceremonial water walker who walks beside different water bodies in Canada. This started maybe 2 decades ago. You may have heard about water walkers walking around the Great Lakes, but I didn't know that Tasha last summer had walked the Saskatchewan River through Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I found her comments, it's a podcast that also has a transcript, her comments about walking through the very dry landscape last summer when we had a lot of heat and a lot of drought, very moving. And especially this comment she makes about committing our bodies, our hearts, our minds, and our spirits to water. And I think in the work that I've done, it's really brought me a lot more information and a lot closer in feeling to what water means to me and what water means to all of us now and into the future. Another inspiration for me when I sort of got this nudge to do some work about the river and about water was a film created by the then Regina-based filmmaker, Ian Taves, who grew up in Nipawin, 291 Film Company. I'd taken this out of the library, the Saskatchewan River Delta. It's a documentary film he made in 2009. I didn't know we had a delta in Saskatchewan. It's actually enormous. It's bigger than the Everglades. It's an inland delta. And I'd taken this film out to just start learning a little bit more about the river. And almost simultaneously, I got an invitation to be part of a SSHRC grant. So with the School of the Environment and Sustainability, they were creating a connections grant proposal called Building Bridges Between Deltas, one of which was the Saskatchewan River Delta. And Graham was involved in that team, and they invited me to be involved as someone who might bring an arts perspective to it and help create some of the art outcomes that were proposed to be part of that project. Graham and I will later talk about the collaborations, that initial collaboration called Building Bridges, and then 2 other collaborations Graham and I did resulting from our connection in that first grant. We'll talk about those a little bit later tonight. But one thing I learned very quickly working with the School of the Environment team is about the dams on the river. So rather than just thinking of Hudson Bay, when I looked north, I was aware there was a dam at the E.B. Campbell Dam just prior to the Delta that had some environmental impacts on the Delta. And south of where I live is the Gardiner Dam, which of course produces electricity for me and all of us in the province, but also has some environmental impacts. So my notion of the river was complicated very quickly as I started to learn from the scientists. One of the first pieces I did in response to that is the piece on the right, which I called River Shirts for Water Managers, I think is the title, where I embroidered the prairie meander on the spine of the back of this white collar shirt. So thinking of a kind of water manager who might be working with the water at the dams and the impact of that. I was ironing it on my ironing board and I kind of glanced at it and thought, that's actually an interesting way to display it, where the shirt is kind of prone and in this somewhat helpless position, So some of what is beneficial and some of what is harmful is kind of implied in the way I've created and displayed that piece. In 2019, I had an opportunity to show some of these pieces as works in progress through the Esplanade Gallery at the historic house attached to the gallery here. And both of them face the river, face the South Saskatchewan River in Medicine Hat. So it's the same river that I live beside, but at a point earlier in its path through the prairies. This is a heritage house, a historical house where one of the first settlers of Medicine Hat lived, and it's now used for residencies for artists. So on the outside of the house, I created some banners on the upper balcony that point to the glacial source. And then also the first image I showed you tonight, the bridge over the river here in Saskatoon, thinking about how we can connect imaginatively and how the river physically and imaginatively connects us to different places along the river, that we're not just at our isolated point. Inside the house, I'll just show a few slides of that installation, but I had completed by then 3 of these river manager shirts, one in the foreground here, which shows the glacial streams. So the really fast running little streams that run off the glaciers up in the mountains, one that shows the prairie meander, and then one that shows the delta, which is somewhat the terminus of the Saskatchewan River before it flows into Lake Winnipeg and then joins the Nelson River to flow into Hudson Bay. I did have a monitor there with a video that's now in the Moose Jaw Art Gallery as a projection, showing my hand sewing this river stream by hand, which is embroidered onto the back with embroidery floss. This was the maid's room up the kitchen stairs at the back of the gallery, which I thought was an interesting place to put the ironing boards and the shirts. At the back, you can see there's a rail there, and that's the staircase going down to the kitchen. And I'd taken some photographs when I was on a tour of the Athabasca glaciers in the Columbia ice fields, and I took one of those images and had it printed repeatedly. And for this installation, I thought it would be interesting to have it sort of cascade down these back staircases, which is what you're seeing here in these 2 images. And I did one piece that was site-specific for Medicine Hat that isn't in the show in Moose Jaw, with a light box, a double-sided light box, and some microscopic samples of water that were from a lab that tests water in Medicine Hat, and it actually tests the water from the water treatment plant in Saskatoon as well. These were samples, I think, specific to Medicine Hat, and I love both the beauty of them and then the reminder when they're sitting here on the bathtub of, when you open the tap, the water has been purified for drinking, but that it also has a local source. Now we're at the entrance to the gallery in Moose Jaw, where my exhibition is currently on view. And Jennifer has a wonderful text here that I hope you have a chance to read. And adjacent to the text, you can see this small lit portal. This is a video piece I created specifically for Moose Jaw. I created 2 site-specific pieces related to Buffalo Pound Lake, which is the water source for Moose Jaw, Regina, and other areas. You can see a little glimpse here when you enter of the blue tarp piece installation in the middle of the gallery, and more of it when you walk around the entry wall. Another view of that. The 2 site-specific pieces I created related to Buffalo Pound used photography from the Global Institute for Water Security, some of the researchers there. Dr. Helen Balch is a water researcher who has a research station at Buffalo Pound. And one of the things I found out about that really interested me was a trail cam, a camera mounted on a buoy out in the lake. And in between May and October, it seasonally takes photographs every hour, daylit hour, of the water surface, the weather, to compile with other data that she collects from that same buoy and from the research station. I thought the visuals of the water were really interesting. You can see a few of them here with the little pink float that holds the buoy in place or indicates where the buoy is. And I asked permission to use these photographs, and I have about 470 from one season, I think it was the year 2018, that I compiled into a video, slowly dissolving them one into the next. So you get a kind of view of the water in that portal entrance space. And then there's also an image here on the right taken by Jay Bauer, who was a grad assistant, I believe, of Helen's. And I've used this with his permission, that shows the Buffalo Pound Lake with the algal bloom in the foreground, which of course is a problem in terms of water quality. The view across the lake to the far shore on the north side of the lake. The lake's really shallow. It's an unusually shallow lake, maybe 10 to 14 feet is what I've read. So there's a lot of warming up of the water that creates some of the water quality issues, especially later in the summer. Then if you enter the main part of the gallery, this is where we've installed the tarps. And what the 4 tarps are, they're actually a map of the watershed that I cut out of these tarps. And the watershed map I created based on 3 road maps of the 3 prairie provinces where the Saskatchewan River moves through these provinces out to Hudson Bay. I traced these road maps, but looking for only the waterways. So I dropped away any towns, any roads, any gridding of the territory to just see what the water path itself looked like. And this is what I ended up with in these drawings up here. So you can see how they're based on the rectangle, sort of the maps are a rectangle, the tarps are a rectangle, but the watershed itself sort of steps northward towards Hudson Bay. I then used these and did a kind of old-fashioned gridding up of these maps to 4 tarps. So each of these became one 12 by 16 foot tarp. And I then drew with chalk the water path onto the tarps and cut the waterways out so that they would kind of drip and fall from overhead as you walked through the space. I was also really interested and didn't really know till we installed this in Moose Jaw how the light would come through the tarps and create a kind of watery effect and a bit of a map drawing in different values on the floor and on the walls in the gallery as well. And I was really pleased. I hadn't installed this until this show in Moose Jaw. It was all folded up in my studio. So it was very exciting and a little nerve-wracking to put this up for the first time, but I was really pleased with how it worked out. There's a couple more views of that. Another piece I did on a small scale initially and then enlarged is a piece called Confluence 1. And it's where the Bow and Oldman rivers meet together and become the Saskatchewan River in Alberta. For this piece, I machine stitched the river path onto paper that I then assembled with an accordion fold into a long book. So it can all fold up into this square shape, or it can be extended like it is in the gallery into this long path of the river with a kind of waving or ripple effect caused by the accordion folds. I then enlarged those to, I think there's 9 or 10 panels where I hand stitched the river path onto these large panels. And again, this was a piece I did in my studio and then rolled up each panel around a pool noodle and put them in a sonotube. So I didn't know, again, till I got to the gallery what this would look like and how it would be installed. I'd done a little bit of a prototype of how much might go up the wall and how much might come across the floor. But it did take up quite a big space, and it was really wonderful to have the space at the gallery to install this piece. So the confluence here is up at the top on the wall, and it kind of cascades down and then across the floor to come out towards the tarps when you're in the space. So here you can see the embroidery is kind of like a drawing on the Pellin material that I used. The topography moves through the Badlands in this case, so it's quite dramatic lines, which I created with the fabric marker onto the fabric panels. Also in this show are the 3 videos of different 2 creeks that lead into the Saskatchewan River, and then the Saskatchewan River, the South Saskatchewan River going through Medicine Hat here at points where the water is melting. So this doesn't show too well in the 3D virtual tour or here, but the one here where there was an ice jam that broke and it just moved through the city when I was in residence at the Esplanade. And it was phenomenal. It was just this rush of ice for several days moving through the city with a lot of silt in the water as well. And quite, if you stand in that room, it's a bit vertiginous. It's kind of moves really fast, but the back horizon stays still. So I wanted this sense of the power of the river. And then there's two creeks here. This was in Medicine Hat, the small one, Seven Persons Creek with ice melting in the spring. And this was Swift Current Creek in the fall when I was down in that area, and the ice was actually starting to set through above the creek. And you can kind of hear, the piece is also audio. If you stand in it, it's a triangular shape. You can hear these levels and layers of the ice and the water in that space. And you can hear it a little bit in the outside space as well. And there's one other video projection here in relation to the shirts, which is my hand sewing the Prairie Meander shirt here in the middle up close, and overlaid with water in the river, some video footage of water in the river. So they come and go, and you can hear geese a little bit at the point where there's water only, and you can maybe hear my hand, you can hear the thread pulling through the fabric a little bit at the point where the hand is more dominant. These are the three shirts then. So this one is the delta, so where the water kind of meanders out. I also wanted to suggest the body like a spine or like nerves. It becomes a bit more like nerves with the delta. And also the intimacy of fabric and of wearing something. You know, if we wore these shirts, perhaps we would think differently about the river, or the managers might think differently about the river, decisions about the river. And then these are the piece that was in the maid's staircase at the house now are on panels on the floor, and 10 of them kind of step across the back corner of the gallery right adjacent to the shirts. And now we're going to switch and talk a bit about, so some of this is how I did the research towards my own studio work. I was working away on some of my projects in the studio at the same time. But these three projects and one additional residency, I learned a lot through doing them. They're different kind of work. They took me away from doing the studio work, but I gained a lot through doing them. So I'm going to turn it over to Graham to talk about Delta Days, the first project in 2016.
Yeah, thanks, Susan, and welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Yeah, so when I came to Saskatchewan in 2011 to join the Global Institute for Water Security, we had a project that was focused on understanding what people thought about this new concept called water security, which was kind of, had been around for about a decade at that time, but was starting to find some place on the prairies. And we went all the way from the Rocky Mountains to Cumberland House to talk to different people along the way. And asked them what they thought about this term. And eventually we found our way to the Saskatchewan River Delta in November of 2011. And when we went there, we were thinking that we were going to talk about a flood. But when we got there, we realized that there was a much bigger story than the flood that had just happened. And so that's what kicked off this bigger work of realizing that there was these three very large freshwater deltas in this middle of Canada that most people didn't even know about, and they were in sort of trouble in terms of the multiple stresses impacting them. You can go to the next slide, Susan. And during the Delta Days, we had kids, students from high schools come from the Slave River Delta, the Peace Athabasca, and Cumberland Delta, and you can see them here doing various art projects, drawing on different natural items that we had scanned, and drawing sort of meaningful places or comments about things that were important to them in their deltas. And then eventually this was to create a sort of display at the end, so you can see the water strips, and they all have writing on them, and then the different kinds of grasses and rocks and trees as well. We also had people draw on maps of each delta of the places that were really important and why they were important and what sort of impacts they had been seeing in those places as the water had changed. You can see some closer images there of some of those places and the names. And this was pretty rich, and the folks, they had a lot to say about what they had kind of witnessed over their lifetime, over about 50 years, of a pretty significant environmental decline. That last piece there, the triangle that's being held in front of Susan, was actually fish scale art. So they took fish scales off of fishes that had been caught, dyed them with different dyes, and then created this pretty amazing delta, as well as some clay features of like a muskrat, fish, a moose, duck, and I believe those clays came from the river itself. So there's a close-up of that, as well as a sort of description of Delta Days and what it was all about, and the legacy artwork. And so members of each community got one of those triangles. Nicole Paul, who had done a coloring page that we actually toured with us when we did a mixed media art installation in 2017, which we took to Cumberland House, Fort Smith, Fort Chippewa, Fort Resolution, and Yellowknife. And along the way, we asked people to write on these sort of these cards, you know, our Delta is, and so you can see here people saying my tradition, my identity, my life, in need of help, our connection, the largest inland delta. So people wrote a whole variety of different things, some positive and some sort of denoting the impacts that they've seen. And this is everybody who was part of the Delta Days, other than the students from the schools, standing together at the end. So after the display was done, we had this idea that we wanted to create something, a mixed media art installation that we would tour with us back to the communities, because the communities partners that we were working with said, you know, we don't want another report. We want something that you're going to bring to the community to get people talking about the Delta, you know, to get them to understand what's going on. So we came up with this design, and Susan was instrumental in doing that design, along with Carla Oros from Drama and Ian Rose from the Department of Drama. And so you can see we're building the structure, which is 3 periactoids, and then having 3 canoes on top, and then pouring from the middle were some of the cultural artifacts from the communities. We also took the rocks, trees, and grasses and made these decoupage eggs and put them in baskets in each of the periactoids. I'm not sure if you can actually all see my mouse. Kids drew on feathers and feet and hands, and they also drew on these large coloring pages that, on the flip side, had a policy brief about what could be done to improve the deltas. There was also videos, multimedia videos, and River Sounder, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. And I also want to highlight this piece here, this dream catcher with a helix coming out of it with duck feathers that was done by Michaela Carrier from Cumberland House. And in the middle, there were also Polaroid photos of people, you know, holding those cards saying, you know, my Delta is, and we got those from kids in schools all across the prairies and up into the Northwest Territories. And this little table here was a river table, which we made to show the impact of reservoirs on sediment. So you can see here the sediment's getting trapped behind this structure, and kids would come and play in this sand for hours. In fact, in some of the communities, we had to send the kids home at about 10 o'clock at night because they just wanted to keep playing. We had a Métis sash that was done here by Dave Morin, and it's back at the Gabriel Dumont Institute, but that toured with us throughout the mixed media installation. And this was the message that we were trying to share. And we eventually got to share that message with Prime Minister Trudeau because we happened to be in Yellowknife at the same time as he was. And we asked, bring back nature's flows, restore the Delta's rhythms, and will your government fulfill its promise of a national water strategy? And so that I think we actually got through to people through these art projects. In fact, probably more through the artistic expression than we ever do through science. So really quite exciting. And so here you can just see some of the different elements that all came out of that Delta Days collaboration. And here's the mixed media building bridges display at the Gordon Oaks Red Bear Center. And this was the second last place. The whole exhibit weighed about 1,000 kilograms. It took about 8 hours to 12 hours to build, depending on who was building it, about 6 hours to tear down. We built it 12 times. And on the 11th time, thinking it was the last one, somebody came in from the Western Development Museum and said, would you be willing to bring it to the Western Development Museum? So it went to the Western Development Museum for 8 weeks, and there were 4,300 people that went through it, which was more than about 2,200 people who saw it on the main tour from Saskatchewan to Northern Alberta and into the Northwest Territories. Over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, and so out of that, we also collaborated on a public art project for the city of Saskatoon, a billboard project called We Are the River. So there's Graham holding a sign. So we kind of picked up on that idea we did with Delta Days of Our Delta Is, but this one said, I am 70% Saskatchewan river water, or some variation on that. And we did several, 4 or 5 community events where we set up photo booths and had people participate. And we also did an Instagram account with that. So here's a couple of photo booths, one by the river, one at the Open Doors Society. And Jennifer can talk about this a little bit later, but there'll be a project in Moose Jaw, We Are the Lake. And if you go to the gallery, there's a green screen set up there. So someone will be able to take your photo if you want to participate, and then it will be layered with a photo of Buffalo Pound. And I think Jennifer's working on finding a billboard location for that as well. Another project Graham and I did was we co-taught a course in the spring term called Becoming Water. And this was partly because Delta Days happened in early April, like right at the end of the school term. And it didn't work really well to involve students in that project. It was too quick and too close to the end of term. But I felt like it was a missed opportunity to have students learn about science and water connections and art. So we got some funding for a collaborative project here. We were awarded this grant, so that allowed us to put together a course with quite a few field trips. I think there were about a dozen students. Graham and I co-taught that in the spring, and we started right in town. We walked from the campus to the weir, which is near the bridge. Here's the bridge I showed you at the beginning that you walk over, and there's this weir that was built maybe in the 30s, a make work project during the Depression. Graham can say more about this, but I never realized this beautiful island out here full of ducks is actually the silt that's held back by this small dam on the river. So even though we might think it's beautiful, it is a problem in terms of the water. Graham, I'll let you talk about these field trips because you know a bit more about the water side. We went to the water treatment plant. You want to add anything there? Just learned how the water's treated.
Yeah, the idea was we wanted to, introduce students to the science that was going on at the U of S. I don't know if most people in Saskatchewan realize, but we have one of the top water research institutes in the world at the University of Saskatchewan. So we're really lucky. There's over 120 professors who focus on water. And recently, just about 3-4 years ago now, there was a Global Water Futures program that was set up that was a $77 million federal grant, which was the largest that the U of S had ever had. And that was building upon many, many years of water science. And so we wanted to introduce the art students to the sort of science of water going on in the Saskatchewan River system. And so we took them to all these different places to show how, humans have an impact on the way water moves through these environmental systems. And so we went to, as Susan mentioned, the weir, the water treatment plant, Gardner Dam, and E.B. Campbell Dam. And we explained the impacts, and the impacts, particularly for the Delta, are that Gardner Dam has an impact on the changing of the seasonal flow. So it effectively reverses the flow over the whole year, where normally there would be a sort of pattern of flow where there's high water in the spring in 2 pulses, the local freshet, which is the local water melting, and then the Rocky Mountain runoff soon after that, a little bit more water, and then slowly tapering off into the summer and getting drier and drier into the spring, and then very low flow in the winter. Whereas now, the Delta sees exactly the opposite, and that's mostly from the control of Gardner Dam, but also there's impacts from the daily hydro peaking that occurs at E.B. Campbell Dam. And so we wanted to show the students those impacts up close. So here you can see the whole Saskatchewan River watershed. So the North Sask flowing from here, the South Sask flowing from here, converging just past Prince Albert. And then here is the Saskatchewan River Delta with Cumberland House community right in the middle. Red Earth and Shoal Lake are around here, and the Paw. And so here's a zoomed in version of the Delta. I'll just kind of trace it with my mouse. Oh,
Oops.
that's
Your
okay.
mouse isn't working, Graham. I don't know.
Oh, you can't. Yeah, I guess you can't see it because
Yeah.
you're controlling the presentation. So anyway, you can see the red outline. There's two lobes of the Delta, the upper Delta on the left, and then the lower Delta on the right, which is in Manitoba. And you can go to the next slide. And in the middle of the Delta, there's people that have been there for many, many years. Evidence of human habitation in the Delta for about 7,000 years. And the community of Cumberland House, which is the oldest European settlement in Western Canada, now predominantly First Nation and Métis settlement. And we took the students to Mystic Lodge and visited the carriers. And that was a photo of Janelle Drever, who had done clay drawing using the mud locally sourced of these women. And then she provided them with the photos after the excursion was done. And here's a day where we were planning on going out and seeing the impact of Phragmites, which is an invasive grass, which is really taking over the Delta, particularly around Cumberland Lake. And that's bad because it outcompetes native plants. And so impacts are huge on things like muskrats, which were a staple food for the local people for hundreds of years. And the muskrat population has collapsed. There was 1 year where there were 750,000 pelts in the Hudson Bay records. And now you're lucky if you can find one at all. And that's because the fluctuation of water levels in the winter has a detrimental impact on the muskrats, but also because the Phragmites grasses are hollow. And so when they build their houses using the Phragmites grasses, they're not as insulated. And so they freeze in their homes. So pretty sad state of affairs. And it's kind of a keystone species that's collapsed in the Delta. And I'll pass it over to Susan to talk about Basha.
Yeah, so we invited Basha Ireland. Some people might know her. She's done a lot of work with water and the rivers for many years. I actually met her when I was a student at the University of Waterloo many years ago. And she's now in New Mexico. So she came up as a guest artist, and some of the students, so we made the ice books. This is a prototype of Basha's, where blocks of ice are carved to look like books, and they're embedded with seeds that are native to the river. So we made them in Saskatoon and then took them up to the Delta and launched them into the Delta up there. And 3 of the students made a repository, a backpack for, according again to a kind of prototype that Basha uses. And then Ian Taves here, we had him make a film about the course. It's a 15-minute documentary. So here's the 3 students who made the backpack repository. And Ian's film, which is online. You can find it to watch it if you're interested. And then there was a final exhibition in the Gordon Snellgrove Gallery in the Department of the Student Work. So both sketches they did along the way, and then they each did one kind of final piece, a kind of cumulative piece summarizing their learning in the course. So that is an image of the gallery. The one other thing that I didn't have on that first slide, Graham and I were invited to do a residency in Mexico to think about art and water there. So I just put in a few slides here of Anima Casa. It's near Guadalajara. And Julian Caleros here is the host. And these were some other people, environmentalists we met there in the valley. And we had several field trips. We went to different sites talking about the impact of water, in this case, farming on the water. To get to Anima Casa, you actually drive through these greenhouses, which if you eat nature sweet tomatoes, that's where they come from. That was pretty sobering. A lot of irrigation adjacent to this water source too, things we see in Saskatoon as well, or Saskatchewan. A success story here, these molasses pits were right by a water source. They were supposed to become molasses pits, but there was a protest and was actually successful. So Jorge, I think, was the filmmaker here who made a film about it, and they did a lot of social media and it raised a lot of funding, and they were able to actually reverse that and protect that water source. And then on the right are some of the sort of research sketches we did while there. Gabriela Garcia Luna, who might be on the call, was one of the participants, and Sarah Brown from Victoria came from Canada with us. So back to Moose Jaw, I thought I would just end back here, and I can stop sharing my screen, and Jennifer may have questions, or some of you may have questions. We'd be happy to answer. Thanks for your attention. Oh, I wanted to mention, I see Patrick up there. Patrick, welcome. Patrick Mann has written a wonderful essay as well, and there'll be a small publication brochure, I think, that will be launched the 9th of April in person in Moose Jaw is the plan right now. And I would be down there giving some small tours too, maybe to small groups for anybody who's local and can come out to that. Please do. And thank you so much, Patrick, for your essay. And Patrick's been involved in art and water projects as well before. What are molasses pits?
Yeah.
Good question. Like, that sounds like a lot of molasses, eh? Graham, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So the pits that they were building were actually for storing almost like tailings. They're not really tailings. I mean, it's like the end product after producing molasses. So where we were which was just outside of Guadalajara in San Isidro de Mazatepec, there's lots of sugarcane production. And even while we were there, they were actually burnt. The first day we arrived, it was kind of an eerie arrival, because when we got there, they were burning the sugarcane, and they burn it so that they can harvest it, because otherwise it's very difficult to harvest because it's sharp. And so they burn the leaves off of it, and then they take the cane and they cut it. So there's quite a lot of molasses production around the area. In fact, there's a main drag as you go towards San Isidro de Mazatepec, which has exploded just in the last 5 to 10 years with bottling plants for various soft drinks, pharmaceutical companies, and all of the water. I would say probably 80 to 90% of the water that they're using is from groundwater, which is a problem. And in fact, while we were there, Julian showed us a stream that flowed where the residency was taking place. And he said, this river almost doesn't flow now. It flows in the summer, but it used to flow all year. And the reason it doesn't flow is because the amount of groundwater withdrawal for growing mostly tomatoes. In fact, there's miles and miles of greenhouses to grow tomatoes, which is a much more efficient use of the groundwater. But nevertheless, the water that they're using is in fact fossil water. It's water that's left over from glaciation. And while we were there, I sent a message to one of my bosses, Jay Famaglietti, who created a satellite called GRACE, which measures groundwater by measuring gravity. So it's two satellites that go around the world, and they chase each other. And when they get closer together, there's more gravity. And when they get farther apart, there's less gravity. So they can measure groundwater with that. And Jay helped to develop that satellite. And in fact, he sent me a picture of, indeed the place where we were, there's been a lot of groundwater withdrawal, and you can see the sort of drying of the landscape that's going on. So back to the molasses pits. So the molasses pits are where they would take the waste from the molasses and leave it to settle. But the place where they wanted to put it was right upstream of this drinking water source for this small town. And in fact, a very kind of important tourism spot, because there were these natural springs that were kind of turquoise, and they had these little fish in them that would come and swim up and, bite you a little bit. It was kind of a weird thing, kind of felt like pins and needles. But that the film was successful. It got national media attention, and they were able to cancel the location of those molasses pits through that activist film that they made.
Great, thank you, Susan and Graham. What a great presentation, and just love the collaborations that you've done together, and to bring about, just to inform people about the deltas and our waterways. I wondered if you could talk about maybe how some of the students that were involved in the collaborations that you worked on, how they've been impacted. Has it impacted their work, and are some of the students sort of carrying on in continuing to do some research in that way.
Yeah, good
Well,
question. Go ahead, Graham.
I was just going to say, Susan, that I see some of the students are on here.
Great.
Maybe,
They could
maybe
answer
they'd like to
themselves.
answer. I see Will and I see Nagar, and I know Gabby's on here. So maybe they could answer for
There you
themselves.
go. Any of them want to unmute?
Sure, I can say a little bit. Yes. Hi, Susan, and hi, Graham. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you again. Yeah. So for me, it was a very interesting experience, and actually, it's affected some of my later works that I've been working on it. So I started trying with material that it was dissolving in water. So it's kind of related to the water, and then it was dissolvable fabric, solvay paper, and later on I also continued working with that fabric with my later works. Um, yeah, yeah, I'm not really prepared to talk about a lot about it, about the course. Yeah, but it was a very good experience, and um, yeah, it was very good.
Thanks, Nagar. Nagar made these very interesting metal wire structures with the solvay paper she described, and then sprayed them and it dissolved. So it looked like, you know, something disintegrating. It was quite evocative of the kind of change, right, that water can cause. Did anybody else want to say anything? Who else did you identify there? You're watching the names more than me, Graham.
Yes, I'm here, Gabriela.
Gabriela.
Sorry, I'm
Hi.
without video, but I'm glad to be here and to listen to this talk. Very, very nice, very interesting. And some of the things that we experienced together, I was doing during my MFA at the University of Saskatchewan. I was doing some research about the Saskatchewan River because I had started some bodies of work related to water in India. So Susan suggested to meet Graham and to know more about the Saskatchewan River Delta. So I met Graham and we went together to basically I joined him in one of his many trips to the Saskatchewan River Delta. I joined him. And knowing the Saskatchewan River Delta had a strong impact in my personal experience and in my work. In my personal experience to see this land that is so naked, so bare, so a piece of land that is very fragile, land and water, of course, but there's so much beauty in it. A lot of migration birds nest there. There are large extensions of marshes and large extensions of forest. It's a very uncommon landscape. It was a very uncommon landscape for me. So it had a very strong impact. And then we had I had the opportunity to go after that and in a residency for 10 days, deeper in the Delta with a family, the only family that still lives there. And I've been continuing working in relation to the river since then. And we had the opportunity also to go to Mexico together to that residency of in Guadalajara in Jalisco state. And so all those experiences certainly have informed my work and enriched my knowledge and almost know more about the place where I live, you know, like knowing about the Saskatchewan River Delta. It was like an eye-opening that this is the largest inland delta in North America. And I didn't know it was in Saskatchewan and things like that. I produced an exhibition in 2019 called Edge, presented at the Art Gallery of Regina in relation to this work. So it's something has, as I mentioned, a lot of impact and will continue, you know, being part of my work in, you know, a big impact in my work. Yeah. And so thank you so much for opening the space for this.
And thank you, Gabby. We would not have survived our expedition to Mexico without you.
I bet.
Gabby was our translator in Mexico too.
Well, and it went far beyond translation.
Far beyond.
Yeah, it was awesome.
I saw a question Linda Duval has here in the chat, wondering about the lack of attention to drought. I think your meeting last summer, so many large lakes near Saskatoon went totally dry. Graham, do you have anything you want to say about the drought and water quantity? Because I remember going to a talk that John Pomeroy and Helen Balch gave at the Roxy, and they were talking about water. And I remember Helen saying, I always think about water quality, but John's talking about water quantity because he deals with the snow in the mountains, right? And he's aware of decreasing quantities of snow. That's apart from the drought, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the water quantity question. Sure.
Yeah, John, he actually does, he does the mountains, but he also does the prairies, and in particular snow and blowing snow and the impact of snow on the prairie landscape and agriculture and the prairie potholes. And he's a man of many hats. He's made a massive contribution to water science in the world, but doing it through the prairies and the Rocky Mountains. But the really interesting thing about doing water research on the prairies is that it's one of the most extreme climates in the world. So we have, huge temperature swings from, the -40s to the +40s. So one of the most extreme climates in the world, but we also have huge swings in terms of, precipitation to drought. And since we've come to Saskatchewan, we moved from Thunder Bay in New Zealand before that, but when we came to Saskatchewan, it had just been, record-breaking wet year, 2 years in a row, multi-year floods, 2010, 2011. And you remember the Trans-Canada Highway washed out in a few locations, and it was pretty extreme. And then things started to dry out a little bit, and then we had the 2013 floods in the Rocky Mountains. And then in 2014, we had the floods in the Assiniboine. And then we haven't had major flooding, knock wood, but that we're seemed to be headed into more of a sort of dry period. But really, it's anyone's guess. And with the impacts of climate change, it's even harder to predict. But we can actually predict the future. But we know that historically, thinking of Dave Sachin's work from the University of Regina, tree ring records that go back 1,400 years. There's been droughts in this area that have lasted 40 to 50 years. And that would be just catastrophic for our society, for agriculture, and even for cities. A 40 or 50-year drought would be a really big deal. The glaciers help out a bit. Most of the water that we drink comes from the Rocky Mountains. Most of the prairie area, only about 10% of the area within the prairies actually contributes to the river most of the time. But when you get those really, really wet years, or multiple wet years in a row, then it can go up to 50%. So you imagine the challenge of the job of trying to model the hydrology of a landscape that can go from 10% contributing area to 50% contributing area. It's very, very difficult. But the good news is people are getting better at it. The team at the Global Institute for Water Security has made huge leaps and bounds in terms of trying to model the prairies, but also to being able to model the atmospheric impact, the hydrology, and the water resources together. And that's what we're really trying to do now, is to be able to bring the sort of precipitation, the rainfall, the snowfall, what happens when it hits the ground, how does it move across the ground and through the ground and into the ground, and then what happens when humans, start taking it out of rivers in different places. So in the Saskatchewan River Delta, the problem is the timing of flow has been changed. But also there's 20% less flow than there was in 1900. So it's pretty significant. I mean, that's a lot. And now there's plans for a large irrigation expansion, which would bring that down even more in the really dry years. So I think the key is to, start thinking about, establishing minimum and maximum environmental flows that are seasonally derived. That's really important. This is, if the water goes below this level in the Saskatchewan River in July, then, you have to stop taking water out of the river. Cities have priority. in Saskatchewan. In Alberta, it's a little bit different, but it's, we are in sort of times that it's going to get harder and harder to manage the water. And the plan for irrigation is one that's not just about economics. It's about trying to redevelop, the central part of the province and benefit from that. But there's going to be impacts downstream. There's just no question about that. And we have to figure out what those impacts are going to be and how to mitigate them. And the key thing, I think, will be a serious engagement plan with the Indigenous communities who are going to be affected downstream and who have been affected historically by a lot of the development plans that have happened in the province that have benefited communities upstream while not benefiting communities downstream. And that needs to change.
So I think a bit of a good news story, Graham, you told me about Bring Back Nature's Flows, right? That was the policy statement that came out of Delta Days. But I think you said there actually has been a slight change with Sask Hydro to change the flow at the E.B. Campbell Dam to not have so much impact in Cumberland House.
Yeah, they are starting to change operations, and part of that's pressure from relicensing. They have new requirements from Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and that's all still being negotiated. But they did let us know that they have changed their operations in response to the community's concerns. So that's great news, because before that didn't happen. In fact, up until around 2004, they used to turn off the river. Believe it or not, they would shut the flow of the river off completely. And then local people teamed up and lobbied and were successful in appealing to Department of Fisheries and Oceans to establish a minimum flow of 75 cubic meters per second. And that's even gone up a little bit since then. In 2008, that was established. And that makes a difference. It probably still not enough. The biggest thing is that the seasonality of flows has completely changed from what was naturally occurring. And all the animals and insects and ecosystem is adapted to that particular seasonal flow. And when you reverse it, they get confused. So birds might start making a nest, once the water starts to drop, and then all of a sudden the water goes back up again and the nest gets washed away. And it impacts everything from insects to birds to entire wetland complexes that don't get flooded as often. And when they don't get flooded as often, they don't get new oxygen, they don't get new nutrients. It's another big part of the story is it's not just about the water and the amount of water, but what's in the water. Most of the sediment that would have eventually made it into the delta is now ending up in Lake Diefenbaker, Caudette Reservoir, and Tobin Lake. And there's no new sediment being added to the Saskatchewan River Delta. And that's a huge problem. So if the province is going to put forward this irrigation project, they really should, look at investing, seriously. And this would be to the tune of probably $100 or $200 million to actually restore the sediment back to the Delta. And that you would do that by dredging it from Lake Diefenbaker, where it's depositing in Myrie Bay, and the irrigators there can't actually get water out of the river because there's so much silt building up there that for part of the year they can't actually access the water that they have licenses for. So it's a whole complicated problem. So you would dredge it, put it on a barge, transfer station at Caudette or at the Capel Arm, put it on trains, 100 train cars a day, like 100 cars every day, all the way up to below E.B. Campbell Dam. That's what the river does naturally. But for the last, since Gardner Dam was built, 1963, it's filling up. And it adds another problem because as it's filling up the lake, you're adding nutrients to the lake. And a lot of those nutrients stay in the lake. And so it creates algae blooms. And if you know anything about what's going on in Winnipeg, they're going to have to spend roughly $1 billion to treat the water for Winnipeg, city of only around 1 million people. That's a lot of money to treat. And if you go back historically to the 1900s in New York City, they actually bought all the land upstream of New York City on the Hudson, turned it back into natural systems because that was cheaper than treating the water that was so loaded with nutrients. So there's huge, I think, cause for trying to use natural solutions as well as technical solutions. There's no question. And there is, benefits to having these dams. I mean, we get electricity, we get a minimum amount, we get a little bit of flood control, but there's also consequences, and we have to start to, use our knowledge to try and mitigate those consequences, if not eliminate them.
Thanks, Graham. There is David Sankochi has his hand up. David, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the talk. Very interesting. And Susan, I had visited the show like virtually, and I thought that was really well done. I guess the museum, they did, I guess it was the museum work. They did a really nice work putting it all together. You can walk around, and I don't know if I'll be able to actually go in person, but it was nice to have the opportunity to go and then see it that way virtually. And so I just have a question, I guess, on something that Graham said, and I kind of like to hear like Susan and Graham on this a little bit. I guess maybe I'll put some context around my question first. I'm like, I kind of live in both the science and the art world. I'm married to an artist. I'm an art student part-time at the university, but at the same time, I'm an environmental engineer. That's what I do for a living. Kind of passionate about both. So I was really interested in a comment you made about Graham, about your message. Like it seemed like you got your message through, and I'm kind of paraphrasing what you're saying, but you got your message through more with the artistic aspect of the project compared to the science, like the science, I don't know, writing papers or whatever, or presenting posters at a conference or whatever you. So I thought, oh wow, that's coming from a scientist, and often you don't hear that often. And I thought it was, so I don't know if you can speak about that a little bit more, and maybe Susan, if she can speak to that as well. Because I mean, I'm interested both from an artist point of view, but also from a science/engineering point of view. And, because what I'm trying to do personally is just kind of having a convergence of these two things in my life, as opposed to two parallel things, right? Like kind of a fusion of the two. So anyway, I'd like to hear a bit
Susan,
more
go
about
ahead.
that.
Yeah, well, I'll start by complimenting Graham on his enthusiasm for the arts, because I forget what that quote was, Graham, that we had after the class, right? Like, do you remember what you said? It was like, sort of like, arts can do this, right? More than science. And I remember you said that to all of us, the students included. The students might correct me, but we're all a little more skeptical maybe than Graham about the power and impact of arts. And it was interesting for me working with Delta Days, that project, and they come out with this policy statement at the end, and they spread this policy statement out to all the communities, and they take it to Parliament. And I thought, wow, this is great to collaborate with a group that actually knows how to do policy and, make political change. Well, Graham can comment on that. I think you're a little more cynical about that, right? Just like we're maybe a little more skeptical about the impact of art. So maybe it's just looking into somebody's other discipline, right? And thinking that they're going to have more impact. But it's an interesting question. I'm going to put something in the chat. It's actually a list I put together, people who might be interested in other resources, both literary and some links and so on, things I've looked at, but I'll put that in there. But one book I'm just reading again, I read it before. It's an Icelandic author, Arni Magnusson, I think is his name, called On Time and Water. And he's more of a literary writer, but I just read a chapter last night where he was presenting in Germany some top climate crisis scientists, at his event. And this guy said to Arnie, the writer, like, you have to write about this, right? People aren't listening to scientists. They need to listen to writers, and they want stories that they understand. And that's how people are going to actually get it, right? And take some kind of action. And that's kind of, I thought of Graham, because Graham has a kind of similar perhaps point of view about the possibility of arts. And I think more and more that when I've gone to GIWS events too, Global Institute for Water Security, I think more and more scientists are looking to the arts to communicate. Sometimes as artists, we might feel that that is instrumentalizing what we do as opposed to it being, knowledge in its own right. I know if Patrick's still on the call, he's also worked with scientists, and Robert Stanford. If I remember in the source catalog for your exhibition, Patrick, there was maybe a similar conversation with Robert Stanford where he was so enthusiastic about the arts and all the artists were a little bit more dubious about the impact. So maybe it's just our disciplines, our discipline perspectives. Do you want to say anything, Graham, about that? I'll put this in there.
Yeah, thanks for the question, David. It's really, that's, I kind of came across science art collaborations when I was at Lakehead University, and it was amazing how different people responded to artistic expression than scientific expression. Most of the time, in the sciences, for a long time, we've had the loading dock model of science to policy, which is where the scientists just back up the truck and dump off their reports at the policy shop and then leave and hope that the policy is good. It's not very effective, and hasn't been. And the first collaboration I tried with artists myself was with a play, because we were trying to communicate these very complex perspectives that people had on this new topic of water security. And we couldn't do it in a PowerPoint presentation. It just wouldn't work. So we created a play, which had these very rich kind of characters, kind of battling it out on stage and talking about these issues that we were dealing with in the sciences, but doing it in a way that people can understand. People understand stories, better than they do scientific reports. Scientists are getting much better at telling stories. And when we've done these, whether it's a theatrical performance or whole variety of different mediums of artistic expression of scientific evidence, it hits home so much harder. So one of the examples that we did in the Delta display was a picture of a chart of the flows on the South Saskatchewan River from 1913 to 2013. And we added sound to it so that it's basically the chart is playing sound. And it sounded sort of like a heartbeat, like on an echocardiogram. And at first it's like a natural rhythmic heartbeat. But then as soon as the dams go in, it's a heartbeat with an arrhythmia. And the Indigenous communities, when they heard that, like they were just blown away. They were like, that's it. That's the problem, is that, the river is essentially like a heartbeat for the earth. And once you change that natural flow, then you run into the issue of, all the environmental consequences of altering that flow. And, I understand, I'm benefiting right now from the fact that we have hydropower. I'm not saying that we have to like tear dams down or anything like that, although that is happening around the world where in some cases it makes more sense to take them down. I don't think we're there yet in Saskatchewan, but eventually, these conversations are going to happen, or do we renew them? And so art can tell stories that affects people's hearts, not just their minds. But when we bring the sciences and the arts together, we can create these coherent messages that really hit home and move people to do things. And that's what has changed. So now I'm totally sold on these collaborations. And, at a time when we're seeing arts programs across North America, for sure, just getting crushed under cutbacks at universities. And it's terrible, because I think we need art now more than ever. And continually we'll continue to need art. So I think, we have to realize the benefit that art brings. And I'm not just saying the instrumental value for communicating science. I learned very early in these collaborations not to intervene with the artists You know, tell them my story. Here's what we've learned. Here's what people have told us. Here's what the science is saying. You do your craft your way. I'm going to stay out of the way. And the further back I go, the better they are and the better the whole production is. So it's not about the instrumental value. It's about seeing the intrinsic value of them telling a story in their way. And it's always better than what I thought it was going to be.
Great, thank you both. Patrick Mann has his hand up and I think has a question or comment. Patrick, would you like to unmute?
Sure. I'll just follow up and say, first of all, thanks so much. I think this has been fantastic. And you know, there's some, I mean, it's a little bit trite, but there's a sense that the quality of the art we're seeing and thinking about and the quality of the scientific kind of engagement that we're hearing about is really substantial. And I think that this goes to, you know, fundamentally, I'd written something down that really basically David raised with his question. You know, sometimes I think in our sort of art field, we talk about this kind of work as research creation. And I'm not totally in love with that term, but I think it helps. And I do think about it, maybe this is somewhat university centric, but I think about it in relation to basically both the kind of wonders and problems of interdisciplinarity. And so I think when we work, you know, across science and arts, or we work as scientists and artists, you know, we're fundamentally kind of challenging, we're both kind of harnessing, but also challenging categories around knowledge and expression. And I think, you know, both Susan and David have done an amazing job of kind of being pretty mobile with thinking about what what artistic expression might be and what scientific knowledge might actually kind of influence. So really, this is fantastic. I think, you know, one of the sort of challenges I think certainly that I experience at times is, you know, rightfully some of my artistic colleagues, you know, kind of ask, well, what's the kind of artistic efficacy of this work? Whatever that means. It sounds like it's somewhat rarefied, but I think it is a question. And similarly, I suspect, David, that or Graham, that some of your colleagues might wonder, you know, is this really necessary to good science? So I'm not in any sense trying to be a detractor, because this is the kind of thing that I'm quite involved in and have been. But I do think that these are important questions too, that, you know, in trying to work together, that we are also ensuring that as artists, we understand something about the rigors of science that maybe aren't available to us because we don't have those expertises. And similarly, that artists are sometimes doing things that are not very good at communicating and are not very engaging for a kind of a broader public, but are really important to culture and all of that. And so, you know, I think that this is really, I love this terrain. It's where I work, but also I'm aware of some of the challenges. So I don't think I'm really asking a question. I'm just kind of, I guess, thinking out loud about some of the wonderful kind of ways that you've laid out a lot on the table. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Susan, would you like to comment?
Well, one thing I was thinking of maybe as you were speaking there, Patrick, and it was just, I don't know that I knew, Graham, that your PhD was in complex systems, but I really like that because I think it's like, what I liked about working with scientists is like complexifies my idea, right? Like maybe I'm a bit in the nature romantic thing still, right? Like a lot of artists are with nature, you know, that, oh, there's the river, it's so beautiful. And we walk by it, we enjoy it, we do enjoy it. But to actually work with scientists, I find out like clear water isn't great, right? Muddy water's better. It's got silt in it, like things like that sort of complicate or contradict even what my assumed idea might be about water. So I like that. I mean, I've always, when I've worked with kind of nature imagery, I'm looking at it through the lens of culture to think about how even historically our notions of nature are informed by cultural moments. So in this case, there was a lot of interesting kind of like information. You can hear Graham with a lot of information, right? It's wonderful. So even the notion that's the media promotes this idea too, right? That the source of our water is the glaciers, Well, in that document I just posted, I forget where I got that information, but like John Pomeroy's research into the snowpack, that's like what percentage? It's in my document. You know, the glaciers are like 6% or something, and the snowpack is huge. So we're not getting upset about the snowpack. We're getting upset about the glaciers because the media, and they're beautiful, right? So they're easier maybe to promote. But things like that, like then you have to kind of rethink what you might emphasize as an artist. I haven't done snowpack work though. I did do a glacier piece, so I don't know if it really, you know, changed my approach. But just knowing things like that, I think it's important to inform maybe where I go with the work.
Yeah, Patrick, some really great comments. When I started down this path, I did get a lot of resistance, especially with the play. We created a script with Kenneth T. Williams. He's a Cree playwright. He's now at the University of Alberta, but he was at the U of S before. And I worked with him to write the play. And we took all of our results and we workshopped it with students, and then we came up with a sort of concept for this sort of play. You can actually see it. It's on YouTube. There's a recording of it. It's not as good because it's, you need to see a play in person. But anyway, when I sent the script to some of my bosses, one of my bosses just tore a strip off me. He said, "Graham, I did not like the play at all. I would not go to it, nor would I encourage anyone to attend. I do not want this shown anywhere near where I work. As your colleague, I suggest you quietly find a way to fulfill your goals." So I knew I was on the right track.
You've got that well memorized, Graham.
Oh, it's imprinted on me, because I thought I was going to get fired, first of all. But then I talked to another boss, and we went through the play line by line, and we had to correct all the hydrological inaccuracies of the play. Imagine a play that has to be hydrologically accurate. I mean, that's pretty difficult to do. But nevertheless, my boss at the time, Howard Weeder, went through it for 3 hours, every line, and we made corrections. And then it went out to a panel of about 20 different people, and they all edited it, right? And then we pulled it back together and we did it. And in the end, I was really nervous. I had no idea how this was going to go over. I'd never produced a play before in my life. I didn't know what I was doing. Thank God for the Department of Drama. We sort of gave them a concept and some resources and then get out of the way. And it was a smash. People loved it. It put people in the decision seat. It wasn't just a play, it was forum theater. So the audience interacted with the actors on stage, but they loved it. And there was no turning back after that. I thought, this is like, it's so hard these days to get through to people with just about anything, but it's so essential that we do. And there's a lot of echo chambers going on, both in the sciences and in the arts, and especially in social media. And so people hear, what they want to hear. But what art does, I think, better than science is it can challenge people in a really different way, right? It can challenge their thinking, their feeling in a very different way than science does. And so I think the challenge that art has is to let anybody know that they can actually appreciate art. And I think that's the big barrier, is that a lot of people feel like, oh, I'm not an artist, so I don't appreciate art. I failed art in grade 8. Like I was that bad. But then later in life, I sort of started to appreciate it when somebody said, I said, I was at an art gallery with an artist friend, and I said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Like, do I just look at the painting? And they're like, yeah, just look at the painting and see what happens. What happens in your mind? How do you feel? And they sort of gave me a bit of guidance on just being a human being experiencing this art. And that's essential. Like, we have to tell people that no matter what they experience, when they see a piece of art, that's right. There's no one way to do it, but I feel like a lot of society is outside of the arts. So you think about Saskatoon, $80 million art gallery, right? Now, there was a bit of uproar about that. That was a hard sell. But if it had been an $80 million hockey arena, nobody would have questioned it. That's, to me, is so tragic that people find it very easy to appreciate sport, and anybody can appreciate sport. They don't have to play it. But very few people feel like they can appreciate art. And so one of the challenges is trying to make art accessible to everybody. And that's, I don't know if we're doing that, but we're trying. And we're trying to get messages to people like it is instrumental, because if we don't do it, like, humanity's in trouble. Mother Nature will be fine, but humans are in trouble, and we've done it to ourselves.
Maybe I'll just take a chance to jump back. Thank you so much, Susan and Graham, and Graham, I thank you and laud your tenacity with this. I guess just two other things I would say, Susan. I actually think that, you know, you talked about science kind of or kind of challenging you with its complexities, but I think that art and artists, well, basically I would say I think that art is really good at dealing with complexity, because I think that an artistic expression can give us something with a sense of simultaneity that if we had to read through a report or some other form, we would be encountering in a more linear way. And the other thing I would say is, and this comes from my more recent experience working with Jeff Thomas, who's an Indigenous photographer and a co-curator on a project I'm working on, but that's storytelling. And I fundamentally think that's what we're actually talking about often when we're talking about art, is a kind of way of storytelling that I think is really quite different as a means of engaging people and reaching people. Well, it's not different. It does its own work that I think maybe we're coming more broadly to understand is really, really necessary in all our cultures if we didn't think about that before. So anyway, thank you so much.
I think some of that complexity, like I think of it like, I like to read poetry. So I think of it as reading poetry versus reading a nonfiction, more didactic, informative text in terms of making art, right? Or how I think of my art in a space. And I don't know, other people who've been in the space, a few people went down with me last week. Jennifer, you've been in the space. So I'm the maker. So I'm kind of in it in a different way than people who would just walk into it. But I think there are those associations that happen, and some of it's sort of like almost peripheral vision too, when you're moving through the space and you're experiencing things, not just visually. I think in this exhibition, there's stuff above you, below you, there's sound, it's somewhat multi-sensory, and you're kind of inside it, gives you a different kind of experience. We're talking a lot, and I said to Jennifer when that event on April 9th is, and I'm going to give tours, I just want everybody to go in there like 5 or 10 minutes by themselves without me talking, because it's kind of a quiet space, right, to be in. And often art is a quiet space to be in yourself with your own experience and your own thoughts. And it's easy to overlay it with language, if I'm giving a tour or something. And I think my feeling with this exhibit is I'd like people to just find out themselves when they're in the space, like discover themselves what that experience is. If you've been on this talk and go, you've had a lot of background information. You can just let it all kind of drop away.
I just wanted to add that's one thing that I think is a real strength about your work, Susan, is that there's this wonderful balance between the research, conceptual ideas that drive and inform your work, and the visceral materiality of it. And it results in, like you mentioned, poetry. I think the works are really poetic. And yeah, do create these meditative spaces for viewers to slow down and really absorb what they're looking at, and what the work is about. And then there's moments too, like the tarps, there's, it talks about sort of the colonial structure that we place on the land. And I love how it collapses and falls apart. because of the waterways, it breaks through that grid system, but it also creates this wonderful magical experience of all that shadow play on the floors and the walls. And so there's so many levels that you can engage in this work. I just thought to mention there is a question from Lisa Vargo, comments and a question. She says, this is such moving, beautiful, and important work. Are you planning another class? Do you have another collaboration in mind? And how do you see continuing to communicate the importance of thinking about water and respecting it and bringing it in perspectives of people like Tasha Beeds?
Go ahead, Susan.
Well, Graham, you might have an answer to those first two questions. Another collaboration. It was a wonderful experience. Pandemic, of course, has put any kind of things like that on hold. I think we both came away from it too, like as you often do when you do these projects in an institution. It took like a lot of work, right, to organize the funding, to organize all the ins and outs of all the field trips and so on. And it seems like the paperwork involved in those things just gets to be more and more and more. So there's some hurdles, to do these kind of wonderful projects. So, and we went to Mexico to do that residency, thinking maybe that could be another opportunity to do a class. There's costs involved, of course, in that. And then there are, with Mexico, some issues potentially around security and safety as well. So those were some things we had kind of brainstormed about a little bit. We haven't had anything really concrete. Do you want to say anything more about those parts? I have to read her third question there again.
Yeah. Susan and I have these sort of mini collaborations that come up periodically where there's an opportunity to give a talk. This one's great. I'm so impressed that there's 40 or 50 people on a Thursday night listening in to this. That's just remarkable. The other thing I would say is I've found ways to bring art into my classes. I teach 5 classes in the School of Environment and Sustainability, systems thinking, design thinking, data-driven solutions for sustainability, regenerative sustainability, and then I manage the placements for 30 or 40 students every year for the summer. And in those classes, I've found ways to bring artistic expression into the work, and most of the students, they haven't done that for a long time. We have the odd student with an art background or a humanities background, but most of them are coming with biophysical sciences, engineering, all graduate students. And, you give them an opportunity to create art, and a lot of them are sort of stunned. It's like the adage, if you go into a kindergarten class and ask how many people can sing, everybody will put up their hand. You ask a graduate class how many people can sing or draw, and nobody puts up their hand. It sort of it's sadly, I think the arts get sort of beaten out of people in our education systems. Most people don't go on to do art, and that's so terrible. I've started painting during the pandemic and making music and doing things because I think I'm probably wired more like an artist than a scientist, but I became a scientist for some reason. And I really think all of the experiences that I've had with Susan, especially, and many other artists, has shaped the work that I'm doing, so that now I always try to think, how do I bring an artistic perspective to anything I'm doing, whether it's teaching a class or writing a paper or whatever. How do I bring that perspective? And we're doing a new project, and this one's slightly scary and super interesting, and that's trying to figure out what to do with the tailing ponds in the oil sands. And this is a massive environmental challenge. One of the grand challenges that Canada faces is dealing with mine tailings, and in this case, oil sands processed water. And so we're working with a team of people across Canada who are doing genomic-based engineered wetlands to treat things like naphthenic acids. And in that project, we have artists working on, explaining the science through different means of artistic expression. And then we're doing decision labs with Indigenous communities, scientists, policymakers to figure out upon what basis should the decisions be made to release water from these large, huge reservoirs. Like we're talking about an area of the surface area of Lake Erie. You know, this is not a trivial thing, and you know, we have to do something about it. We can't just leave it there. So we're trying to figure out how do you treat that to make it so that it's safe to come back into the environment. And I don't think we could explain to a wide variety of people only using science. But when we bring an artistic frame to it and an artistic expression, it makes the science so much more accessible. That's been our experience. And so we're doing that for the project in oil sands. We have a project on the prairies, looking at things like wetland drainage, nutrient loading, and then of course the Saskatchewan River Delta, which is where most of my work, my research work takes place when I'm not teaching. So in all of those spaces, I try to bring art and have artists come and visit the students and talk to the students. We take the students before COVID on field trips. Now we do virtual field trips to galleries. And I have to say, this is really important. That person who, you know, initially wasn't very happy about the play came around in the end, and not just in a small way, came around to such an effect that artistic expression is now central to the work going on in the Global Water Futures program. You know, it's a significant part of every program within the largest university-led water science program in the world. So the arts are making it in that space. You know, and it's maybe constrained more than it could be in terms of how it's being done, but hey, it's a start. It's like the modification of the flows at the dam. It's not as much as we want, but it's a start. And you know, the snowball gathers more snow as it rolls down the hill. So that's exciting.
Are there any other, there's some really wonderful comments in the chat. I'm not sure, Susan and Graham, if you've had a chance to check them out, but is there any other questions for Susan or Graham? And somebody posted also another artist from Iowa, an artist science collaboration from Iowa in the chat room as well.
Look that up.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, this was a fantastic discussion. Thank you both, Graham and Susan, for sharing your insights on the collaborations that you've done, and love the discussion about the importance of connecting art and science. You know, like you said, Graham, especially now. And oh, thanks, Graham, for posting that.
That's the virtual gallery. And this would have been done differently had we not had a pandemic. You know, there would have been more shows, and I think, you know, if we come out of the pandemic in such a way that people can meet in person, there will be a large exhibit towards the end of the program, which is only a year and a half away, believe it or not. But it's some really great work from a whole wide variety of scientists all around the world and artists all around the world. So check it out if you can.
And go to Moose Jaw.
And go to Moose Jaw. Sorry, Susan. Oh.
And go to Moose Jaw. Well, that's just, you know, just remember Moose Jaw too. When I send out announcements to people, I made this little like also in Moose Jaw, because I keep discovering these wonderful little things besides the mineral hot pool, which is fabulous. But Moose Jaw is full of little wonderful surprises. So enjoy Moose Jaw if you go to see the show. Enjoy the show, and then there's a few other things to do there too.
Yes, if you can, please come see the show. I mean, we do have it virtually on our website, but it's not the same as seeing it in person. It is really incredible exhibit and a wonderful experience. And there is information about the collaborations in our lobby as well. And of course, if you'd like to take part in our We Are the Lake community art project. That would be great. So I will just mention again, Susan mentioned it before, we are going to be doing a reception or hosting a reception for the exhibition, where Susan will give a tour of the, we'll do a small artist talk and do a tour of the exhibition and launch the catalog as well, which will be coming out and features Patrick Mahan's essay.
So your dad, I'm just going to say this while Aaron's on, because your dad sent me this email earlier today, and he said he did the virtual tour, and then he said, like, we have a bit of blue tarp culture down here because you get all the hurricanes and the rains and the flooding, right? Like blue tarps can mean something different when you live in hurricane land.
It's good that you're still here to ask that. So when
This is my niece, Erin, in Louisiana.
Hi, y'all.
Hi.
She's also an artist.
Was she in Saskatoon, Susan, or different?
No, that's
in
her sister,
Saskatoon when I
Rachel.
was 9 years old.
Oh,
That's
when she
the
was
only
9 years
time I
old.
visited Saskatoon. So the blue tarps.
Mhm.
Okay, so tarps are extremely useful, correct? Like a versatile plastic thing. And so this is interesting, you know, like talking about how maybe bad tarps are for the environment, but how good they are as art materials. But anyway, Bob just left. So hurricanes have blown through America through every single year, and homes stay damaged in the impoverished areas, such as Lake Charles from 2 years ago. There's a big old hurricane that blew through 2 years ago. And if you drive over the bridge that spans Lake Charles, all you see is blue tarps.
That's what your dad was referring to. They use them as roof covers.
Yes, they are, because that's what they can do. They're just big plastic coverings that can stretch across a roof until the government can pay to fix it eventually, maybe a little bit 4 to 5 years later. You know, it's pretty weird. It's weird to drive over an area that was afflicted 3 years ago by hurricane, 2 years ago by a hurricane, and just see the city covered in blue tarps.
Okay.
And that's what you see. I was shocked.
Yeah,
Because
I've
of the
never seen that.
pandemic happening right after the hurricane, I didn't see that until he and I took a drive last year late, and I was like, wow, none of that is repaired. That's amazing. People's homes just covered in tarps. And if you go through a neighborhood, maybe you can identify like a super elderly or poor person's home because it's covered in a blue tarp, because that's how they can repair their roof. That's the only way.
Yeah, and I think if we think even of refugee camps, right, often tarps are what create the temporary homes. So I think the tarps, you know, in my context here, they're like, we use them to go camping, we use them to wrap stuff against the snow in the winter. So they have different associations and meanings than they might in some places.
Well, the meaning is the same, and it's protection.
Water protection, yeah.
Any protection, cold, winds, water damage, but you know, that's really sad. And that's my 2 cents. And I know y'all have been working so hard, and I wanted to tell y'all all that the extent of research that you put into this, to tapping into different minds about making sure they understand how important this is awesome. And y'all pulled it off beautifully. Thank you so much. It's like, I'm so excited to see y'all talk about it here. You reach us over here.
Thank you all for attending tonight. This was really great. Like you said, Graham, this was a great turnout and really great conversation. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's so heartwarming to see you all here and to have this conversation. So thanks so much. Wonderful way to spend
Thanks, everyone.
the night.
Thanks,
you,
Susan and Jennifer, for organizing this. And it's nice to meet everyone. And I hope at some point we can see you in the flesh.
Yes. All right. Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.